One thing that is pretty well documented is the interplay between inflammation and, of course, insulin resistance in the first place. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with high levels of glucose. That just has to do with sort of the inflammatory, like sort of IL-6, TNF alpha that kind of elevates when you're hyperinsulinemic. So with that, if inflammation is elevated and your immune system is activated to a certain degree, then you're kind of like chronically having this undulating like immune system activity, which is not exactly a good thing, right? You don't want to have this white blood cells and you don't want to have a low scale attack or a low grade attack happening all the time. And then it's perpetual. And then it kind of goes into its vicious cycle, because then you have an inflammatory response, which sort of, I kind of liken it to almost like static. It's like the cells can't communicate properly. They can't receive the signal from insulin. They can't dock in the insulin receptor properly because you have so much of this inflammatory storm going on.
Yeah.
So of course, it makes logical sense that your immune system would be suppressed as a result. So when you kind of look at illness and metabolic syndrome in the first place, yeah, I mean, that's kind of your first line of defense. And I think, we think metabolism, we think, oh, this is what's responsible for me gaining and losing weight. I mean, the metabolism is every energy dynamic in our body. So it's the equation of taking energy from food and ultimately creating energy for our body and producing ATP. And if that is deranged in one way, it's going to have a trickle-down effect across all kinds of systems.
Yeah. And now you've even got me thinking, like, people who get injured, like from working out, and they can't seem to repair from that. Like, you start to correlate when you look at it from that inflammatory standpoint. I mean, it's almost like you could correlate almost everything to it. Dr. Boz?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And, she's a big believer in hemoglobin A1C, and that if it's over 5, that you're now insulin resistant and it's affecting oxygen flow to your cells. So everything from brain cognition to muscle repair to energy is going to be affected. But she really says it from the standpoint of its oxygen, its lack of oxygen, because all that glucose gums up the red blood cells, and those red blood cells are moving oxygen to your tissues to keep them healthy.
That's interesting. I mean, that has some merit to it for sure. I think the caveat with that would be if you're a very active person, like a really active person, I don't think it's as big of a deal to have over a 5 HbA1c, because you're just the amount of circulating glucose that can reflect in your HbA1c if you're a really active person and you're someone that consumes a fair amount of carbohydrates, but you're also active. With that caveat, it does make sense as far as the oxygenation piece is concerned. I think that, with that, like, there's kind of these two pieces that we have to look at metabolism in general, probably more than that, but realistically, we've got fuel getting into the cell, glucose, fat getting into the cell, whatever. Okay, fuel substrates, but oxygen is also a fuel too, right? So we have oxidative phosphorylation. We require oxygen for any kind of aerobic activity, and to a certain degree, even though anaerobic is literally without oxygen. I mean, for the tasks that are going on sort of underneath that, the baseline tasks, though it's still involving aerobic metabolism. So if you have poor oxygenation, then that's not going to work very well. I don't know. I'm sure there is some literature out there somewhere about sort of circulating glucose gumming up that ability. I'm not aware of it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because that's a really strong theory. It makes sense. Again, protect the cell, because that excess glucose in a lot of ways could actually travel to the liver. It could change and alter into what's called serum palmitate, which ultimately becomes a saturated fatty acid. And then that saturated fatty acid, that serum palmitate, can affect insulin resistance. So a lot of times you see, okay, the glucose is being allocated and going to the brain, which is one of the reasons that I theorize why you might have more brain energy on a fast. Now, I haven't seen data to back it up. It's purely a theory, but it's like, maybe it's not just the ketones that are making our brain feel better when we're fasting. Maybe it's purely the reallocation of glucose, and we're actually getting more glucose into the brain, because the brain does like to run on glucose. Let's not deny that.
Yeah.
So if you're sparing glucose physiologically throughout the periphery and it's allocating to the brain, it would light up your brain more. I just haven't seen data to back it up. It's all just my own hypothesis.
It's really interesting. And maybe it's the combination of glucose with ketones, because if you think about it, and this leads me to my next question, but if you think about it, when we go into a fasted state, especially the longer fast, we're seeing the dumping of the stored sugar, and you're also seeing the rise of ketones. So it's one of the only scenarios where we see ketones and glucose go up at the same time. And maybe that's where the brain really thrives, is in that moment.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. And you see that with a lot of the exogenous ketone research too, is that's what makes it really unique, is you are putting yourself in a very interesting state. And having high levels of insulin and high levels of ketones at the same time is, I don't want to say it's impossible, but physiologically pretty much impossible, right? Like you cannot have this crazy spike in insulin insulin from carbohydrates. So that's why, like with exogenous ketones, it creates this physiologically impossible state. And that's why it works so well as an ergogenic aid, because like for a Tour de France athlete, it's working well because they are in a very unique, almost unnatural ability to utilize carbs and ketones at the literal same time.